we have Martin, who's going to present the last presentation before we go into our Q&A. This time it's right.
Thank you. So I'm here to talk about measurement. I think measurement's probably, from the buy side, is probably a fairly good summary of a lot of the issues you've already heard about today. So a few key points on it. Infectious Media, we're a programmatic agency. In Europe, we work with brands like Adidas and Expedia. So I'm going to give you 20 years of measurement history in the next 7 minutes. Slightly depressingly, I think everything I'm going to tell you is really obvious, at least in hindsight, and actually there is no answer at all to this question. So if I start with the goal of measurement, and I think, when we think about the goal of measurement, I actually think what we're talking about is moving from advertising from being a cost center, so it's an investment for advertisers, to something that generates a profit for them. That fundamentally is the end goal of measurement, I think. And as an industry, we've been disrupted. Nikki talked about that this morning, and I think, what's ignored is advertising is going through its own disruption, and programmatic is that disruption, actually. And we need to change the way we plan, the way we buy, and I think more importantly, the way we measure advertising. So to start with, this is how we measured display advertising probably 20 years ago. We cookied everyone. We claimed every single conversion that we could claim, and it seemed like an amazing model. So in this model, we took 100% of share, and I think this is, this was probably peak shitty measurement when we started out, and it probably caused so many problems in the industry. So it meant that what we wanted to do is we wanted to buy cheaper, smaller and smaller ad spaces, more and more volume, and it really sent the industry off on the wrong footing, really, right at the start. So that was probably peak crappy measurement in our space. So then the next model that we looked at to measure was actually post-visible. Programmatic came along, and we got some technologies that we've talked about today that could tell us if an ad was actually seen or not. Now, this is quite a revolutionary thing. So what we started to think about was, okay, well, if only 40% of the ads are viewed, then 60% of those conversions that we've been claiming, actually, they weren't there to be claimed. So we're reducing the inaccuracy of our measurement model by 60% by disregarding the non-viewed impressions. We thought that was great. We thought we'd solve the problem, but actually we hadn't solved the problem. We created 2 new problems. The first was, how do you actually define whether an ad has been seen or not? Is it 50% of the ad for 1 second? Is it 100% of the ad for 3 seconds? So we actually didn't understand what someone viewing an ad actually meant. And then I think the second problem that we actually encountered is we didn't know if any of those conversions were actually incremental or not. So we kind of created a second monster, really, which was around incrementality. So understanding what would have happened if someone hadn't been exposed to an ad. So I think the next measurement model that we moved on to, and this is probably only about 2 years ago now, was to think about how are we going to create a baseline for advertising so we can understand if we've shown ads to somebody what the incremental uplift is. So the programmatic industry, we started to think about those wasted ads that we had, those non-viewed ads, so the 60% of ads that weren't actually viewed. Well, we could use those as a baseline, and we could measure the uplift versus that baseline. So we went from a position probably overnight where we were ruling out 60% of those conversions. We were now ruling out 83% of the conversions that were delivered by display advertising. So, we were actually starting to prove the effectiveness even more accurately. And I think we were doing that for probably a year as a business internally. And then actually we realized that we had 2 further problems that we created. I think we still didn't really understand if someone had viewed an ad or not and what that really meant. But the second thing we started to understand is that, as Michael said, fraud is absolutely rampant in the programmatic space. So for those of you that are into the kind of data and the modeling side of things, I think you have 2 variables in the model. You have the conversion rate of your holdout group, so your baseline, in this case, the non-viewed ads, and then you had the conversion rate of your viewed ads. And because fraud was so prevalent in that non-viewed group of people, we actually created this incredibly low baseline conversion rate that we were measuring against. So we were measuring an uplift that wasn't really there. So once again, probably 18 years into digital display measurement, we created a model that was overstating the effectiveness of the ads. So as a business, again, we moved on in our thinking, and the latest incarnation of that incrementality model is probably going back to the start in some ways. It's a 90-10 split methodology where you're using a demand-side platform to create a holdout group of which you serve a charity ad to them, and then there's 90% of people who are served a brand ad, and you measure the uplift versus the two groups. So what you're now seeing is that from that 100 conversions that you were claiming 20 years ago, you're now actually only claiming 6 conversions, so you've ruled out 94% of the conversions. What we also saw, and this is the new problem that we're facing in the industry, is that the margins are actually really fine now. So I think we've advanced measurement to a point where we're much more accurate. But actually, what we were seeing within the uplift between those groups was a kind of declining and very small incrementality. And then we stumbled upon something that's so incredibly obvious in that cookies are not people. Again, it sounds incredibly obvious in hindsight, but when you're using a cookie as an ID for a person, what we saw was that the 90-10 was actually 86.8 in the brand group, 9.8 in the charity group, and 3.4% of people that were in both groups. Because a cookie is not a persistent ID. You have Apple as part of that problem. You have people who block cookies. So people are crossing over both groups. So we've created a new measurement problem for ourselves. So as a business, again, we've come up with a fix for that around, we now use a 90-10 demand-side platform to do that. We then use an ad server to then verify the splitting of those two groups. And you're in a position where now you have a very clean split, and you're actually got attributed about 5% of the conversions. I think what's interesting is that, so we've got to a place where we can kind of prove with some degree of accuracy that 5% of those conversions are legitimate. The problem we have now is we have no idea of those 100 which of the 5 are actually the ones that were incremental or not. So I think while we've moved on a ton in measurement, and we can determine the channel a bit more effectively, we're actually at a position where we can't really use that data very much to optimize campaign performance, and I think that's the next barrier to measuring performance. Thank you.